She was never interested in marriage. Her mother
sorry, I just
forced
can't
her
do this
into
right
it,
now. We'll talk
sealing
later.
a business deal to save their failing company. On their wedding night, her millionaire husband said he was too tired and fell asleep early. Around 2 a.m., she was awakened by soft, passionate voices echoing through the hallway. Confused, she stepped out of the room and quietly followed the sound until she opened the door of her mother-in-law's room. And what she saw shattered her soul. From that night on, her revenge began. Cold, calculated, and unstoppable. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel. May the Almighty bless every woman with strength that no storm can break, peace that no pain can steal, and love that lights every dark corner of her world. May her voice always be heard, her worth always honored, and her heart forever protected by divine grace. She is the rhythm of every home, the soul of every family, and the heartbeat of this world. But my beloved family, YouTube has made up its mind to silence our light, to vanish our family channel. I've fought, I've prayed, I've given my all, and tonight tears fill my eyes. If you are not with me now, you may lose Mr. Peter forever. I need you, not as followers, but as family. Let's rise again, stronger than ever, together. Like this video, comment, and share it with your best friends. Our mission is 1,000 hearts of love. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. She had walked into that marriage, wearing white like a lamb to slaughter, her mother's desperate tears still wet on her hands, her family's dying company the price of her freedom. But when Jessica Bruce opened that door at 2 a.m. and saw her husband tangled with another woman in the room down the hall, something inside her didn't break. It crystallized, it sharpened, and Chris Mitchell, the millionaire who thought he'd bought himself a quiet, obedient wife, had no idea he'd just created the architect of his own destruction. The hallway was dark, except for the sliver of light coming from the guest room. And Jessica stood there in her wedding nightgown, barefoot on cold marble, watching through the cracked door. Chris's back was to her, his shoulders moving rhythmically, and the woman beneath him had her head thrown back, blonde hair spilling across the pillow. Jessica didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply watched, her hands still on the doorframe, her breathing steady and controlled. Then the blonde woman opened her eyes and looked directly at Jessica through the gap in the door. Their eyes met for one terrible second, and Jessica saw recognition there. Not surprise, not guilt, recognition. This woman knew who Jessica was. This woman had been waiting for this moment. Jessica pulled the door closed silently and walked back to the master bedroom where she was supposed to have spent her wedding night. Her feet made no sound on the marble. Her hands didn't shake. She closed the door behind her, locked it, and stood in the center of the room that smelled like expensive cologne and lies. The wedding dress hung on the closet door like a ghost. All that white silk and lace that her mother had insisted on, saying it would make everything legitimate, make the business merger look like a love match. Jessica stared at it, remembering how her mother had cried while fastening the buttons that morning. You're saving us, baby. You're saving your father, your sister, everyone. The Mitchells are good people. Chris is a good man. You'll be happy. Jessica had wanted to scream that she didn't want to marry a stranger for a business deal, that she was only doing this because her father was sick and the company was drowning, that her happiness was being sacrificed like an offering to cruel gods. But she had looked at her mother's desperate face and said nothing. Now she unpacked her suitcase methodically, hanging each piece of clothing in the massive walk-in closet that was supposed to be theirs, but would only ever be hers. She arranged her toiletries in the bathroom with precision, lining up bottles and tubes in perfect rows. She removed her jewelry piece by piece, the diamond earrings Chris's mother had insisted she wear, the pearl necklace that had belonged to some Mitchell ancestor, all of it cold against her skin. Then she lay down on the bed, fully clothed in her nightgown, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just thought, calculated, planned. The blonde woman's face kept appearing in her mind, those eyes that recognized her. Where had Jessica seen her before? She replayed every moment of the past few months, the engagement party, the wedding planning, the family dinners. Then it came to her with perfect clarity. The engagement party. 3 months ago, a blonde woman in a green dress talking to Chris's mother Catherine in the corner of the ballroom, both of them looking at Jessica across the room. Catherine saying something that made the blonde woman laugh. Jessica had thought nothing of it then. Now she understood everything. This wasn't an affair. This was a test. Catherine had arranged this, wanted Jessica to discover it, wanted to break her spirit on the very first night, so she would know her place in the Mitchell family hierarchy. The cruelty was intentional, surgical, designed to destroy any hope Jessica might have had. But Catherine had miscalculated. She thought she was breaking a naive girl. Instead, she had awakened something cold and patient and absolutely merciless. When Chris opened the bedroom door at dawn, he looked exhausted and guilty, his shirt untucked, his hair disheveled. He found Jessica sitting in the chair by the window, fully dressed in a cream silk blouse and black pants, reading the newspaper with her legs crossed elegantly. Jessica, I had some business calls from overseas. The time difference, you know how it is. I didn't want to wake you. Jessica looked up at him, and her face showed nothing but polite interest. Your mother called. She wants us for breakfast. We're expected in an hour. Chris blinked, thrown by her composure. Right, yes, I should shower. You should, Jessica agreed, returning to her newspaper. He hesitated in the doorway, perhaps expecting tears or accusations. But Jessica just turned a page, her diamond wedding ring catching the morning light. Chris retreated to the bathroom, confused and somehow uneasy. Jessica listened to the water running and thought about the blonde woman's face. She would find out her name. She would find out everything. And then she would erase her. The breakfast at the Mitchell mansion was exactly as Jessica expected. Both families gathered in the formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and antique furniture, everyone playing their assigned roles. Her mother, Diane, was nervous and grateful, constantly touching Jessica's arm, whispering how beautiful the wedding had been. Her father, Raymond, looked diminished and ill, barely touching his food, guilt written across his face in lines Jessica had memorized. Her younger sister, Natalie, was bright and cheerful, talking about the flowers and the music, the only person at the table who seemed genuinely happy. Across from them, Catherine Mitchell held court like a queen. She was beautiful in that maintained way wealthy women achieved through expensive procedures and ruthless discipline. Her dark hair swept up elegantly, her neck adorned with pearls that probably cost more than Jessica's father had earned in his entire life. Marriage requires flexibility, Catherine said, cutting her melon into precise pieces. Young wives must understand that their husbands have responsibilities, demands on their time. The Mitchell family has built something extraordinary, and maintaining that requires sacrifice from everyone. Jessica smiled pleasantly and said nothing, but she felt her mother tense beside her. Of course, Diane rushed to agree. Jessica understands. She's always been such a sensible girl. I'm sure she is, Catherine replied, and there was something in her tone that made Jessica's hands tighten on her fork. Chris, darling, you look tired. Late night? Chris was distracted, barely paying attention to his new wife, scrolling through messages on his phone. Just overseas calls, Mother? The Berlin property is having issues. You work too hard, Catherine murmured, but her eyes slid to Jessica with satisfaction. Jessica, dear, I hope you weren't lonely on your wedding night. The room went quiet. Natalie stopped talking mid-sentence. Jessica's father looked down at his plate. Her mother's face went pale. Jessica met Catherine's eyes and smiled. Not at all. I unpacked and caught up on some reading. The bedroom is lovely, Catherine. Thank you for the redecorating. Catherine's smile tightened just slightly, and Jessica saw it. The flash of frustration that her weapon had missed its target. Then the dining room door opened, and a woman entered. The blonde from the guest room, now dressed professionally in a navy dress, her hair pulled back, looking refreshed and confident. Jessica's pulse didn't change. Her breathing remained steady, but she catalogued everything about this woman in a single glance. "I'm sorry I'm late," the woman said, taking the empty seat beside Catherine. "Morning meetings ran long." Catherine smiled warmly. "Everyone, this is Amber Whitley, my protégée. She's been invaluable in our operations management. Amber, this is Jessica, Chris's new wife." Amber looked directly at Jessica, and there it was again, that knowing look, that satisfaction. "Congratulations on your wedding. I've heard so much about you." Jessica looked at this woman who had been in her husband's bed hours ago, who was now sitting at the family breakfast table like she belonged here. "How lovely to meet you. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." Something flickered in Amber's eyes, confusion perhaps at Jessica's lack of reaction. Catherine was watching carefully, waiting for tears or accusations or some kind of breakdown that never came. The rest of breakfast passed with polite conversation about the wedding, matters that went over Jessica's head intentionally, and Catherine's stories about Mitchell family history. Jessica played her part perfectly. The quiet new bride, occasionally touching Chris's arm when appropriate, laughing at the right moments, never revealing anything happening behind her eyes. After breakfast, while everyone gathered in the drawing room, Jessica excused herself to use the bathroom. She stood in the marble luxury of the powder room, staring at her reflection in the gilt-edged mirror. Her face looked the same, but something fundamental had changed behind her eyes. She pulled out her phone and made a call to a number she had memorized but never intended to use. When the man's voice answered, gravelly and cautious, Jessica spoke quietly. "Uncle Gerald, this is Jessica Bruce, Raymond's daughter. I need to meet with you today, alone." There was a long pause. "Your father forbade contact. He called me a monster." "He was right," Jessica said. "That's exactly why I'm calling." Another pause, then a low chuckle. "The Riverside Hotel bar, 4 o'clock. Come alone." Jessica ended the call and reapplied her lipstick with a steady hand. When she returned to the drawing room, she found Natalie waiting in the hallway. "Jess, are you okay?" Mum said Catherine was being awful at breakfast. Jessica looked at her baby sister, still innocent and hopeful, and felt something almost like tenderness. "I'm fine, Nat. Everything's fine." "You seem different," Natalie said, studying her face. "Something changed." "I just grew up," Jessica replied, squeezing her sister's hand. "Finally." That afternoon, Jessica met Uncle Gerald in the dark corner of a hotel bar that smelled like expensive whiskey and old secrets. He was in his 60s, sharp-eyed and well-dressed, with the kind of face that had seen too much and regretted nothing. He studied her for a long moment after she sat down. "You look like your grandmother. She was the only person in your family worth knowing." "I need your help," Jessica said simply. Gerald leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What happened?" Jessica told him about the wedding night, about Amber, about Catherine's calculated cruelty, about the breakfast that morning. Gerald listened without interruption, his expression growing more interested with every detail. "Catherine Mitchell," he said finally. "I've heard of her. She destroyed her first husband, took everything he had. She's a professional predator." "Then I want to learn from someone who knows how predators work," Jessica said. Gerald ordered 2 whiskeys and slid one across to her. "What makes you think I'd help you? I haven't spoken to your family in 15 years. Your father called me a monster and made sure I'd never work in this city again. Why would I teach you anything?" Jessica picked up the whiskey glass, held it without drinking. "Because I can give you back everything he took from you. And because you want to see what happens when someone like Catherine tries to break someone like me." Gerald studied her face, looking for weakness, for the girl who cried when things got hard. He saw none of that. "Tell me what you're willing to do." "Whatever it takes," Jessica said. "Easy to say, harder to do." Gerald pulled out a piece of paper and wrote an address. "There's a man at this location who owes your father money. A lot of money. He's been hiding from the debt for 2 years. Find him, get me proof he's there. Do that, and we'll talk about what I can teach you. Jessica took the paper, looked at the address. That's all? That's the test, Gerald said. Most people think they're ruthless until they actually have to do ruthless things. Come back when you have proof, or don't come back at all. Jessica left the bar and went directly to the address Gerald had given her. It took her 3 days of surveillance, of following leads, of asking questions in places her father would have been horrified to find her. She found the man in an apartment under a false name. She took photographs, documented everything, and brought it all back to Gerald. He looked through her evidence and nodded slowly. You actually did it. Most people would have given up or hired someone to do it for them. I don't give up, Jessica said, and I don't delegate revenge. Gerald raised his glass. Then let's begin your education. That night, back at the Mitchell mansion, Jessica claimed the guest room as her own, telling Chris she needed space to adjust to married life. He barely protested, too consumed with his phone and his business and his secrets. Jessica locked the door, opened a new leather journal and began writing. Not her feelings, not her pain. Just facts, names, connections, weaknesses. On the first page, she made a list in her invented shorthand that no one else could read. Catherine Mitchell, Chris Mitchell, Amber Whitley. Underneath, she wrote one word that would become her religion, her purpose, her reason for breathing. Erase. Jessica set down her pen and looked out the window at the manicured gardens of the Mitchell estate, at the empire built on cruelty and maintained by destroying people like her. She thought about the girl she had been yesterday, walking down the aisle in white, still believing in possibilities. That girl was dead. In her place was something new, something that didn't need to announce its danger because everyone would learn soon enough. Something that would smile pleasantly while learning exactly where to cut deepest, and she would start tomorrow. Chapter 2. The Education. Jessica met Uncle Gerald twice a week in different locations across the city, each meeting a test of her commitment and capability. He didn't hand her strategies wrapped in kindness. He made her earn every piece of knowledge through tasks that pushed her boundaries, watching to see if she would break or harden. Find out where Catherine banks, Gerald said during their second week. Not just the obvious accounts, the hidden ones, the ones she doesn't want anyone to know about. Jessica spent days following paper trails, befriending bank employees with carefully constructed stories, piecing together fragments of information like a puzzle. When she brought Gerald the account numbers, he studied them with satisfaction. "You're better at this than I expected," he said. "Most people lack the patience for real investigation. They want immediate results, dramatic confrontations. You understand that destruction takes time." Jessica absorbed everything Gerald taught her about reading people, about finding weaknesses in every armor, about the power of patience and timing. She learned how to plant doubts without seeming to criticize, how to isolate people from their support systems, how to make someone question their own perceptions until they couldn't trust themselves. At home, Jessica played her role with careful precision. She was courteous to Catherine without being subservient, establishing a quiet presence that Catherine didn't know how to dismiss. When Catherine made cutting remarks about Jessica's background or her family's financial struggles, Jessica would simply look at her with those empty eyes and change the subject, never giving Catherine the emotional reaction she was hunting for. Chris barely acknowledged his wife's existence. He left early for work, came home late, and spent his evenings in his study or out at functions where Jessica wasn't invited. Amber was always somewhere nearby, at family dinners or social events, a constant reminder of Jessica's humiliation. But Jessica never confronted her, never showed anger or hurt. She simply watched, collecting information about Amber's routines, her insecurities, her complete dependence on Catherine's approval and Chris's attention. One evening, Jessica was reading in the library when Devon Mitchell found her there. Chris's younger brother had been polite but distant at the wedding, and Jessica had barely spoken to him since. He looked surprised to find her alone. "I didn't know anyone actually used this room," Devon said, gesturing at the leather-bound books lining the walls. "Most of them are just for show." "These aren't," Jessica said, holding up a worn copy of an architecture book. "Someone actually read this one. The margins have notes." Devon came closer, curious. "That was my father's, Theodore. He died when I was young, but I remember him marking up books constantly. My mother burned most of them after he died, said they were clutter." Jessica heard the pain in his casual tone, the loss underneath. "She burned his books?" "She burned a lot of his things," Devon said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. "Said she was making room for the future. I managed to save a few and hide them here." Jessica saw an opportunity but didn't push. She simply asked questions, learned about Theodore Mitchell's vision for the hotels, understood how Catherine had corrupted everything after his death. Devon talked more than he intended, starved for someone who seemed genuinely interested in his father's legacy rather than dismissing it. "You don't work in the family business," Jessica observed. "I have a small place in the historic district," Devon said. "Nothing compared to what Chris runs, but it's mine. I design the spaces myself, choose the art, make it personal. My mother hates it. Chris thinks I'm playing at being an entrepreneur." Jessica heard the lifetime of dismissal in his voice. She filed it away without making promises or offers. Just listened, learned, and let Devon feel heard for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Jessica had another task from Gerald. "I need you to get inside Catherine's private study. There are documents there, files she keeps locked away. I need photographs of everything." Jessica spent 2 weeks planning the infiltration. She learned Catherine's schedule, identified when the study would be empty, practiced picking the lock on similar mechanisms. When she finally entered that forbidden space, her hands were steady as she photographed every document in Catherine's files. What she found was devastating. Evidence of Catherine's systematic theft from the family trust fund, documentation of her affair with a judge, records of payments to someone named Dr. Vivian Cross for consulting services. Jessica photographed everything and brought it to Gerald. He looked through the evidence with savage satisfaction. "This is enough to destroy her. But you're not ready to use it yet. You need more pieces in place first. Catherine has been building her empire for decades. You've been building yours for weeks. Be patient." Jessica understood. Revenge rushed was revenge wasted. She needed to position herself perfectly before striking, needed to ensure that when Catherine fell, she fell so completely there would be no recovery. Gerald also taught her something darker. "You need to understand Dr. Vivian Cross. Catherine has been using her for years, paying her to provide psychological manipulation tactics. Cross is a mercenary who specializes in teaching powerful people how to control others. Can I get to her?" Jessica asked. "Everyone has a price," Gerald said. "But you need to offer more than money. You need to offer her something Catherine can't. Figure out what that is." Jessica spent weeks researching Dr. Cross, learning about her practice, her reputation, her conflicts with professional ethics boards. She discovered that Cross was being investigated for her controversial methods, that her license was in jeopardy, that Catherine's continued patronage was one of the few things keeping her practice afloat. Jessica arranged a meeting with Dr. Cross at a cafe, introducing herself simply as someone interested in understanding behavioral dynamics. The psychologist was sharp-faced and assessing, immediately suspicious. "Why are you really here?" Dr. Cross asked, stirring her coffee with precise movements. "I want to understand how Catherine Mitchell operates," Jessica said. "The psychological techniques she uses. I'm willing to pay for that education." Dr. Cross smiled thinly. "Catherine is my client. Professional ethics prevent me from discussing her methods. Catherine uses you to manipulate people," Jessica said calmly, "including her own children. I'm not asking you to betray her directly. I'm asking you to teach me the same techniques you taught her. Aren't you a consultant?" "Consult for multiple clients." Dr. Cross considered this. What makes you think I'd risk Catherine's displeasure? Jessica pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of complaints filed against Dr. Cross with the licensing board, evidence of her controversial methods, documentation that could destroy her practice if brought to the right authorities. Because I can make these disappear, or I can make them multiply. Catherine pays you well, but she can't protect you from professional ruin. I can. Dr. Cross looked through the folder, her face paling slightly. When she looked up, there was something almost like respect in her assessment of Jessica. You're more dangerous than you look. Catherine tried to break me, Jessica said. Instead, she taught me that playing nice gets you destroyed. Now I'm learning to play her game. Are you going to help me or not? Dr. Cross named a figure that would have horrified Jessica's father. Jessica agreed without hesitation, and over the following weeks, Dr. Cross taught her everything. How Catherine had shaped Chris from childhood using intermittent reinforcement, alternating praise and criticism in unpredictable patterns that made him constantly seek her approval. How Catherine used guilt and obligation to control. How she isolated people from support systems. How she made victims question their own perceptions. Catherine is a master of making people destroy themselves, Dr. Cross explained during one session. She doesn't attack directly. She creates conditions where her targets make increasingly destructive choices while believing they're acting freely. By the time they realize what happened, they've lost everything, and she's standing there looking innocent. Jessica absorbed all of this, not just learning the techniques, but understanding the psychology underneath. She began seeing how Catherine had used these same methods on her, the breakfast interrogation designed to humiliate. Amber's presence meant to establish hierarchy, the constant subtle criticisms intended to erode confidence. But Jessica refused to be eroded. Instead, she turned the techniques back against their source, studying Catherine the way Catherine had studied her victims. Every conversation became data collection. Every family dinner revealed new vulnerabilities. One evening, Jessica secured her family's future. Her father, Raymond, was deteriorating rapidly, and Jessica knew time was running out. She went to him at the house where she had grown up, finding him in his study, surrounded by papers and regret. "Jessica, sweetheart," Raymond said, trying to smile. "You didn't need to come all this way." "I need you to trust me with something," Jessica said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Sign over your shares in the company to me." "All of them." Raymond looked stricken. "Jessica, those shares are supposed to be your inheritance. I can't just give them to you now." "You can and you will," Jessica said, her voice firm but not cruel. "I'm going to save what you built, but I need complete control to do it. Natalie doesn't want the factory, but I do. Let me have it." Raymond studied his daughter's face, seeing something there that worried and impressed him in equal measure. "What happened to you? You're different since the wedding. The Mitchells thought they could use me," Jessica said. "They were wrong, but I need your shares to protect our family. Do you trust me, Dad?" Raymond was too sick and too guilty to refuse. He signed the papers Jessica had brought, transferring his controlling interest in Bruce Manufacturing to her alone. When it was done, Jessica kissed his forehead, feeling the first small piece of her plan lock into place. Her mother called that night, crying. "What did you do?" "Raymond is devastated. He thinks you're becoming like them. I'm becoming exactly what I need to be to survive them," Jessica said. "Tell Dad I love him. But I'm not the little girl he remembers anymore." She hung up before her mother could argue, feeling the distance growing between her and her old life. It was necessary. Sentiment was weakness, and she couldn't afford weakness. Late at night, alone in her room at the Mitchell mansion, Jessica updated her journal with careful notes about everything she had learned. Gerald's teachings, Dr. Cross's insights, Catherine's patterns, Chris's vulnerabilities, Amber's dependencies. She was building a map of destruction, and every piece of information was another coordinate on that map. The girl who walked down the aisle in white was dead and buried. In her place was something harder, sharper, more patient than Catherine had ever been. something that didn't need to announce its intentions because actions would speak clearly enough. Gerald told her during their latest meeting that she was ready to begin the active phase. "You've gathered your weapons. Now it's time to start using them." Jessica thought about Catherine's smug face at breakfast, about Amber's knowing look, about Chris's casual dismissal. She thought about being purchased like property, about being tested and humiliated on her wedding night, about being expected to accept it all with gratitude. "Then let's begin," Jessica said. And in the dark corner of that anonymous bar, with Gerald's savage smile reflecting her own determination, the war truly started. Not with explosions or confrontations, but with quiet moves that would topple dominoes months from now. Patient destruction, the kind that Catherine had perfected but never expected to be used against her. Jessica raised her glass to her teacher, and they drank to the systematic annihilation of everyone who had tried to erase her. She would erase them instead so completely that even their memories would become cautionary tales. And she would do it all while smiling pleasantly and playing the perfect wife. Because that was the cruelest irony of all. Catherine had created the weapon that would destroy her, had forged it in fire on a wedding night, and now that weapon was aimed directly at everything the Mitchell family held dear. Chapter 3. The First Strike. The opportunity came wrapped in Catherine's condescension. Jessica was having tea with her in the sunroom, maintaining their charade of cordial relations, when Catherine mentioned the upcoming anniversary celebration with casual dismissal. "The hotels have been in the Mitchell family for decades," Catherine said, arranging roses in a crystal vase. "We should host something significant. A gala, perhaps. Chris is too busy to plan it properly. You could make yourself useful, Jessica." Jessica saw the trap immediately. Catherine wanted her to fail at a visible task, another opportunity to demonstrate Jessica's inadequacy in front of the influential families who mattered. Jessica set down her teacup with careful precision. "I'd be honored. Should I coordinate with your usual event planners?" "Do whatever you think best," Catherine said, her tone making it clear she expected mediocrity. "Just don't embarrass the family." Jessica began planning with meticulous care, but not for the reasons Catherine expected. She had Uncle Gerald investigate every name on the guest list, building profiles of power dynamics, hidden resentments, business frustrations. She learned that several key partners were questioning recent decisions, that tensions existed between various factions, that Chris's aggressive expansion had made important people nervous. But Jessica's most audacious move was the venue. She approached Devon privately about hosting the gala at his boutique hotel. Devon looked at her like she'd suggested hosting it on the moon. "Jessica, that's insane. My place is beautiful, but it's not grand enough for a Mitchell event." "Catherine will never agree." Jessica sat across from him in his small office, surrounded by architectural sketches and fabric samples. "Your hotel is perfect. Intimate, beautifully designed, unique. It will showcase your talent to exactly the people who matter." "Catherine will object, but I'll handle her." "Why are you doing this?" Devon asked, studying her face. "Helping me, I mean. What's in it for you?" Jessica met his eyes without flinching. "Your family has been keeping you small because you threatened Chris's position. They've spent years making you feel like you're not enough. I know what that's like. So I'm giving you a platform. What you do with it is up to you." Devon looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but when Catherine explodes, I'm letting you handle it." When Jessica presented the venue choice to Catherine and Chris, the reaction was exactly as expected. Catherine's face flushed with fury, but they were in a board meeting with other family members present, and she couldn't create a scene without looking petty. "Devon's hotel is hardly appropriate for a Mitchell anniversary celebration," Catherine said, her voice tight with anger. Jessica had prepared for this. "I researched extensively. The major hotels are booked with competing events on our preferred dates. Devon's property offers exclusivity, architectural distinction, and the kind of intimate elegance that will make this event memorable rather than merely large. Several board members have already expressed enthusiasm for the venue. She'd spent weeks ensuring those board members were indeed enthusiastic, having individual conversations where she praised Devon's vision and suggested that Mitchell Hotels could learn from his innovative approach. Now they nodded in agreement, and Catherine found herself outmaneuvered in front of witnesses. "Fine," Catherine said, the word like glass in her mouth. "But if this fails, the responsibility is entirely yours." "Jessica." "Understood," Jessica said pleasantly. Knowing she had just given Devon a gift Catherine could never take back. The gala planning gave Jessica legitimate access to every major partner and investor. She met with the Langford family, the Torres brothers, Sandra Willoughby, each meeting carefully constructed to seem like courtesy, but functioning as intelligence gathering. Jessica asked questions that seemed innocent, but led them to articulate concerns they'd been suppressing. With Richard Langford, she mentioned casually that she'd been reviewing expansion projections and found some assumptions interesting. She didn't criticize, just expressed curiosity, and let Richard explain his own doubts about the European ventures. With the Torres brothers, she wondered about oversight procedures after Trevor's embezzlement, and they revealed their frustration with Chris's lack of transparency. With Sandra Willoughby, she praised Theodore Mitchell's original vision, and Sandra admitted she worried those values were being lost. Jessica planted seeds without seeming to plant anything at all. Just asked questions and listened and let them convince themselves that changes might be necessary. The night of the gala, Jessica wore a dress the color of blood, fitted perfectly, and she moved through Devon's hotel like she owned every inch of space. She remembered names without referring to notes, asked intelligent questions that revealed genuine understanding, laughed at jokes without performing, and demonstrated a comprehensive knowledge of the hospitality industry that she'd spent months acquiring. Devon's hotel was indeed perfect for the event. The intimate spaces encouraged real conversation rather than performative socializing. The artistic details impressed without overwhelming, and by evening's end, several influential families approached Devon about hosting their own events at his property. Jessica watched Devon's confidence grow throughout the night, watched him transform from the dismissed younger brother into someone people respected. She had given him something Catherine could never provide, genuine opportunity earned through talent rather than grudging family obligation. Chris noticed his wife for the first time in months. He kept watching her across the room, seeing how easily she commanded attention, how naturally people gravitated toward her intelligence and warmth. When their eyes met, Jessica didn't smile triumphantly. She simply looked at him with that same empty expression, raised her glass slightly, and turned away to continue a conversation with Sandra Willoughby. Catherine's face was tight with fury all evening, watching Jessica charm everyone who mattered, watching Devon's property become the talk of society, watching her careful plans to humiliate Jessica backfire spectacularly. But she couldn't cause a scene without revealing her intentions. So she maintained her gracious hostess facade while seething underneath. After the gala, in the car ride home, Chris spoke to Jessica for the first time in weeks. "You did well tonight." Jessica continued looking out the window at the passing city lights. "Thank you. Mother was right. You have capabilities I didn't recognize." Jessica turned to look at him, and in the darkness of the car, she let him see something cold in her eyes. "Your mother doesn't know anything about what I'm capable of." Chris felt something unsettling slide down his spine, a premonition he couldn't quite name. "What does that mean?" "It means you should pay more attention," Jessica said softly. "To a lot of things." When they arrived at the mansion, Chris followed her inside, and for the first time since their wedding night, he reached for her. His hand caught her wrist as she moved toward the stairs. Jessica looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. She didn't pull away violently or make a scene. She simply waited utterly still until Chris became uncomfortable and released her. "We should talk," he said. "We've been married for months and we barely speak." "Whose choice was that?" Jessica asked, her voice soft and devastating. Chris had no answer. Jessica walked up the stairs without looking back, and behind her, Chris stood in the foyer, feeling like he'd just been dismissed by someone far more powerful than he'd ever imagined his quiet wife could be. The next morning, Catherine summoned Jessica to her private sitting room. The older woman was vibrating with barely controlled anger. Her gracious mask completely dropped now that they were alone. "You made quite the impression last night," Catherine said, the words sharp as knives. "Thank you," Jessica replied, settling into the chair Catherine hadn't offered. "Don't play innocent. I saw you working that room, charming everyone, promoting Devon over the family properties. What exactly are you playing at?" Jessica met Catherine's eyes without flinching. "You asked me to plan a memorable event that would reflect well on the family. I did exactly that. If you're unhappy with the results, perhaps you should have been more specific about what you wanted." Catherine leaned forward, dropping all pretense. "I wanted you to fail. I wanted everyone to see that you're nothing special, just a girl from a bankrupt family who should be grateful for the Mitchell name. Instead, you made yourself look competent and made me look like a fool for underestimating you." Jessica stood slowly, and something in her movement made Catherine's next words die in her throat. "I'm not nothing, Catherine. You tried to break me on my wedding night, but you failed. Now I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Get used to it." She walked out of Catherine's sitting room, leaving the older woman standing there with dawning unease, finally understanding that the quiet girl she'd tried to destroy had somehow become dangerous. That afternoon, Jessica met Uncle Gerald and told him about Catherine's reaction. Gerald studied her face and smiled with savage pride. "You've drawn blood. Now she'll come at you with everything she has. Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready since the moment I opened that door on my wedding night," Jessica said. "She created this. Now she'll have to live with the consequences." Gerald slid a new folder across the table. "Then it's time for the next phase. Chris's second in command, Trevor Hastings, has been stealing significant amounts. I have all the documentation. When you're ready, we expose him, and Chris loses his closest ally and his credibility with the board." Jessica looked at the evidence of Trevor's embezzlement, seeing the next domino ready to fall. "How long until we can move?" 2 weeks, Gerald said. "Less if you push it." 2 weeks, Jessica agreed. "Let Chris feel secure for just a little longer. It will make the fall harder." She left the meeting feeling the first real stirring of satisfaction. Catherine was starting to understand she was in a fight. Devon was rising with Jessica's support, creating division in the family. Chris remained oblivious, which made him vulnerable. And soon Trevor would be exposed, leaving Chris isolated and paranoid. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Patient destruction, the kind that looked like coincidence until the pattern became clear. And by then it would be too late to stop. Jessica returned to the Mitchell mansion and found Natalie visiting. Cooing over wedding photos with Diane, her sister looked up and smiled, but there was something in her expression that gave Jessica pause. "Jess, can we talk? Alone?" They walked out to the garden, and Natalie turned to face her with worried eyes. "You scared Catherine? I saw her face when you left her sitting room. She looked genuinely afraid of you." "Good," Jessica said. "That's not good," Natalie insisted. "You're changing into something I don't recognize. This revenge thing, it's consuming you." Jessica looked at her innocent sister and felt that distance growing wider. "They tried to erase me, Nat. I'm just making sure they never try it again." "But at what cost?" Natalie asked. "What happens when you've destroyed everyone who hurt you? What will be left of you?" Jessica had no answer for that, so she changed the subject and walked back inside, leaving Natalie standing in the garden, looking worried and sad. Late that night, Jessica updated her journal with careful notes about the gala's success. Devon's rising confidence, Catherine's fear, and Chris's dawning awareness that his wife was not what he'd assumed. She wrote about Trevor's impending exposure, About the board members' growing doubts? About the careful architecture of destruction she was building? On her wedding night, Catherine had tried to teach her a lesson about power and place. Instead, Catherine had created a student who would surpass her teacher in every way. And tomorrow, Jessica would continue being the perfect wife, pleasant and supportive, while the mechanisms she'd set in motion continued ticking toward inevitable detonation. The war had truly begun, and Jessica was winning. Chapter 4. The Betrayal. 2 weeks later, Trevor Hastings was arrested at his office in front of his entire staff. Jessica heard about it from Devon, who called her sounding shaken. "Trevor's been stealing millions. Chris just called me. He sounds destroyed." Jessica was having coffee on her apartment balcony, watching the sunrise. Her voice remained calm. How terrible. Trevor was his closest friend. "You don't sound surprised," Devon said carefully. "Should I be?" Jessica asked. "People betray each other all the time in this world." After hanging up, Jessica allowed herself a small smile before schooling her features back to neutral. She had work to do, a careful performance of supportive wife confronting her husband's crisis. Chris was in his study when she found him, surrounded by documents, his face gray with shock and betrayal. He looked up when Jessica entered, and she saw genuine devastation in his eyes. "Trevor's been arrested," Chris said hoarsely. "My best friend. He was stealing from the company. From me." Jessica settled into the chair across from his desk, her face showing appropriate concern. "I'm so sorry. I know how close you were. How could I not see it?" Chris asked, more to himself than to her. "All those reports, all those meetings. He was lying to my face for months, and I just believed him. People are good at hiding their true nature," Jessica said quietly. "Sometimes we only see what they want us to see." The scandal rocked Mitchell hotels exactly as Jessica had planned. Stock prices dropped sharply, and the board called emergency meetings that Chris attended, looking increasingly haggard and defensive. Catherine tried to control the damage, but her influence had weakened, and the board members resented her interference. Jessica attended one board meeting as an observer, sitting quietly in the back, while Chris defended his oversight procedures. She watched the board members' faces, cataloguing their doubt, their frustration, their loss of confidence in Chris's leadership. She never spoke during the meeting, but afterward she made sure to have private conversations with key players. With Richard Langford, she expressed concern about Chris's stress levels. "He's carrying too much responsibility. I worry about him." With Sandra Willoughby, she mentioned the benefits of distributed leadership models. "Sometimes one person at the top creates vulnerabilities." She never criticized Chris directly, just expressed wifely concern and asked thoughtful questions that led them to their own conclusions about necessary changes. Meanwhile, Jessica had been quietly investing in Devon's hotel through shell companies Gerald established. Devon didn't know where the funding originated, assuming the anniversary gala had attracted genuine investors. His property underwent subtle but significant improvements: better linens, enhanced lighting, an art collection that attracted media attention. Within months, Devon's boutique hotel became the preferred venue for society events, and he gained confidence with each success. Chris watched his younger brothers rise with growing resentment, seeing Devon succeed where he was failing, not understanding Jessica's invisible hand behind it all. At a family dinner, Catherine finally addressed Devon's success with characteristic bluntness. "Your little hotel is doing well. Perhaps it's time to bring it properly into the family business. Let Chris help you expand." Devon set down his fork, his voice steady. "I prefer to keep it independent." "It's mine." "That's selfish," Catherine snapped. "The family gave you everything. Now you owe us your loyalty." "I've repaid what I borrowed," Devon said quietly. "What you gave me you used as control. I'm done with that." Chris joined his mother's side. "She's right, Devon. You're benefiting from the Mitchell name. That has value." Jessica watched the two men circle Devon like predators, and she set down her own fork with deliberate care. Devon built his reputation through his own talent. His hotel succeeds because it offers something unique. Shouldn't the family be proud of his independence rather than trying to absorb it? Catherine turned her cold gaze on Jessica. Family business doesn't concern you. I'm Chris's wife, Jessica said, her voice pleasant but unyielding. That makes me family. The dinner ended in tense silence, but afterward Devon found Jessica in the library. You've been helping me, haven't you? The investments, the sudden improvements. That was you. Jessica didn't deny it. Your family has been crushing you for years. I gave you resources. What you built with them is all yours. Devon looked at her with growing understanding. When this all comes apart, whose side will I be on? On your own, Jessica said. Always your own. But when the time comes, remember who supported you and who tried to destroy you. Devon nodded slowly, and Jessica knew she had secured another piece on the board. When Chris fell, Devon would not save him. Jessica also began working with Dr. Cross more intensively, learning about Chris's psychological conditioning. The psychologist explained how Catherine had shaped her son from childhood, creating someone who constantly sought approval but never felt secure. Catherine was afraid Chris would become independent, Dr. Cross explained during one session. So she developed strategies to keep him emotionally dependent while thinking he was making his own choices. He rebels in small ways that don't matter while following her fundamental directives without question. Like marrying me, Jessica said. Exactly, Dr. Cross agreed. He probably thought it was his decision, but Catherine orchestrated everything. She chose you specifically because you seemed manageable. That was her greatest miscalculation. Jessica filed all this information away, beginning to understand Chris not as the monster from her wedding night, but as a weapon Catherine had forged and wielded. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained how he'd become capable of such casual cruelty. One evening, Chris came to Jessica's room looking exhausted and lost. She let him in but remained standing, keeping distance between them. Everything's falling apart, he said. Trevor betrayed me. The board questions everything I do. Mother is pressuring me constantly. I don't know who to trust anymore. Jessica watched him struggle, seeing his foundations crumble. That must be difficult. Chris moved closer, reaching out to touch her arm. You're the only person who doesn't seem to want something from me. Everyone else wants my money, my name, my position. But you just exist, independent, strong. Jessica didn't pull away from his touch, but didn't lean into it either. Maybe that's because I never expected anything from you. You made that clear on our wedding night. Chris flinched. I know I hurt you. I was thinking only about what Mother expected, what I thought was acceptable. I didn't see you as a real person, just another obligation. And now? Jessica asked, genuinely curious what he would say. Now I see someone who's stronger than anyone in my family, Chris admitted. You don't need me or fear me or try to control me. You just exist in your own right. It's terrifying and impressive. Jessica stepped back, breaking the contact. I appreciate your honesty, but recognition doesn't undo damage. You can't build on foundations you destroyed. Chris looked wounded, his ego bruised by her continued rejection. Can we at least try to be friends? Partners in this marriage, if not lovers. We're partners in name, Jessica said. That's all we'll ever be. After he left, Jessica stood at her window watching the city lights, thinking about Chris's words. He was starting to see her as a person, but only because his world was crumbling and she remained standing. That wasn't genuine growth. That was just recalibration of who held power. Uncle Gerald called the next morning with news. Catherine's been stealing from the family trust. I have complete documentation. Years of systematic theft from Chris and Devon's inheritance. Millions siphoned into offshore accounts. Jessica felt electricity run through her. This is it. The weapon that destroys her completely. There's more, Gerald said. She's been having an affair with a judge. Several rulings for Mitchell hotels came from him. It's corruption on top of theft. Jessica thought about Harold Pemberton, Catherine's first husband, who had written in his suicide note that Catherine erased his existence. Now Catherine would understand what that felt like. "We need Bernard," Jessica said. "Theodore's brother. If he presents this to Chris with us, it will carry more weight." Gerald arranged the meeting, and Bernard Mitchell arrived looking older but with fire in his eyes. When Jessica showed him the evidence of Catherine's theft from the trust his brother Theodore had established, Bernard's hands shook with rage. "I always knew," Bernard said hoarsely. "Theodore told me something was wrong before he died, but she moved so fast afterward, pushed me out before I could prove anything." "Now we can prove everything," Jessica said. "Will you help us bring this to Chris and Devon?" Bernard looked at this young woman who had married into his family and somehow become its avenging angel. "Theodore would have liked you. He always said the strongest people were the ones who refused to stay down. When do we do this?" "Tomorrow," Jessica said. "At the mansion, with both brothers present. Catherine needs to face all of you at once." That night, Jessica barely slept, running through every detail of the confrontation to come. She had Gerald's documentation, Bernard's testimony, Dr. Cross's psychological insights, and the smoking gun of Catherine's systematic betrayal. Everything was aligned perfectly. Tomorrow, Catherine Mitchell would fall, and Chris would watch his mother be destroyed by the wife he'd underestimated, the woman he'd betrayed on their wedding night, the instrument of divine retribution he'd created through his own cruelty. Jessica stood at her window, watching the pre-dawn darkness, feeling no joy or satisfaction, just cold determination to see this through to the end. Catherine had tried to erase her. Instead, she had created someone capable of erasing back. And tomorrow, everyone would learn that lesson simultaneously. The student had not only surpassed the teacher, but had learned when to deploy the weapons she'd been gathering for months. Catherine thought she was fighting a naive girl. Tomorrow, she would discover she was fighting someone who had studied her, learned from her, and ultimately became better at destruction than Catherine had ever been. The war was about to reach its first major victory, and Jessica felt nothing but the ice-cold certainty that this was necessary, deserved, and only the beginning of the devastation to come. Chapter 5. The Mistress Destroyed. Before confronting Catherine, Jessica needed to eliminate Amber Whitley. The mistress had been a willing participant in Jessica's humiliation, had looked her in the eye on that wedding night with satisfaction, had sat at the family breakfast table the next morning like she belonged. Jessica had been patient, studying Amber for months, learning her patterns and vulnerabilities. Now it was time to execute her removal with surgical precision. Amber's entire identity revolved around two things: Chris's attention and Catherine's approval. Without those anchors, she would drown. Jessica set about removing both. Chris had been meeting regularly with Simone Reichert, a sophisticated German businesswoman exploring partnerships. The meetings were legitimate, but Jessica saw how they could be weaponized. She had private investigators photograph Chris and Simone at dinner, capturing moments of laughter and animated conversation, innocent images that could be interpreted as intimate through the right lens. Jessica arranged for these photographs to be delivered to Amber's apartment, with a note typed on plain paper. "Some people are replaceable, others are just temporary." She didn't need to see Amber open that envelope to know how it would land. The paranoia would eat at her. The fear of being discarded would consume her logic, and she would self-destruct exactly as Jessica intended. Within days, Amber made her fatal mistake. She confronted Chris at his office, hysterical and accusatory, demanding to know if he was replacing her with Simone. Several colleagues witnessed the scene, and Chris was humiliated and furious at her unprofessional behavior. "We're done," Chris told her coldly, his voice carrying through the office. "This is inappropriate, and I won't tolerate it." Jessica heard about the confrontation from Devon, who had been present for the disaster. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before schooling her features back to neutrality. But Amber wasn't finished drowning yet. She came to the mansion that evening, finding Jessica alone in the garden. The blonde woman looked destroyed, her makeup smeared, her hands shaking with desperation. "You did this," Amber said, her voice raw. "Somehow you orchestrated this." Jessica looked up from her book, her face showing nothing but mild curiosity. "Did what?" Chris ended things. "He called me paranoid and unprofessional. But I saw those photographs, Jessica. Someone sent them to me. Someone wanted me to confront him." Jessica set down her book carefully. "Perhaps he genuinely is with someone else. Chris isn't exactly known for loyalty." Amber's face crumpled. "You knew, this whole time you knew about us?" "And I saw you that night," Jessica said, each word precisely placed. "I opened the door to the guest room. I watched you with my husband. You looked right at me through that gap in the door. Do you remember?" Amber's face went white. "I didn't know you were there until you opened your eyes and looked directly at me," Jessica interrupted. "And the next morning you sat at Catherine's right hand at breakfast like you belonged there. So yes, Amber, I've always known. I've been watching you every single day since." Amber sank onto the garden bench, understanding starting to dawn in her eyes. "Catherine said you needed to understand your place. She said it was a test, that you'd accept it and know your role in the family." "How did that work out?" Jessica asked softly. "What are you going to do to me?" Amber whispered. Jessica stood gathering her book. "I'm not going to do anything to you. You're going to do it all yourself. You already started when you confronted Chris publicly. Now watch what happens next." She left Amber sitting in the garden, and within the week, Chris had transferred Amber to Los Angeles, ostensibly to oversee a struggling property, but really to create geographic distance. Jessica made sure the assignment was positioned as a last chance, a test of Amber's capabilities without Chris's direct support. Alone in Los Angeles, isolated from the only people who gave her identity meaning, Amber began to unravel. Jessica arranged for anonymous wine deliveries to her apartment, expensive bottles with unsigned cards, saying things like, "For the lonely nights and to help you forget." She was enabling Amber's self-destruction while maintaining complete deniability. Uncle. Gerald's contacts reported back regularly. Amber was drinking heavily, showing up late to work, making decisions based on emotion rather than analysis. Her confidence, always fragile, evaporated without constant validation from Chris and Catherine. Then Jessica played her final move. She had Gerald's technical specialist create a perfectly forged email chain showing Catherine and Chris discussing replacing Amber with someone more stable. The emails discussed Amber's emotional instability, questioned her competence, and suggested she was becoming a liability. The forgery was delivered to Amber through a deliberate, accidental send from a fake account. Amber believed it completely. Within 2 months, she made her catastrophic mistake, approving a renovation contractor who had been recommended by someone she trusted. The contractor was unlicensed, causing massive structural damage. The lawsuit would cost Mitchell Hotels millions, but the contractor recommendation had come through one of Gerald's proxies, a trap Jessica had constructed and Amber had walked into blindly. The board demanded Amber's termination, and Chris fired her via email, too busy to even call. Jessica made sure she was copied on that email chain, reading Chris's cold dismissal of someone he'd once taken to bed on his wedding night. Jessica arranged to be in Los Angeles for unrelated business when she heard Amber was working at a budget hotel chain near the airport. She attended a charity event in the area and found Amber there, looking hollow and desperate, her maintained beauty starting to fade under stress and alcohol. In the ladies' room, they were briefly alone. Amber looked at Jessica's reflection in the mirror, and her face crumbled with recognition and understanding. "You destroyed me," Amber said. "Every step. Every mistake I made. You orchestrated all of it." Jessica reapplied her lipstick with a steady hand. "You participated willingly in humiliating me on my wedding night. Catherine arranged it, Chris executed it, but you were there by choice. You looked at me through that door and felt superior. Now you understand what it feels like to be nothing." "I'm sorry," Amber whispered. I'm so sorry. Catherine promised me security, and I was stupid enough to believe her. Jessica turned to face her directly. Catherine destroys everyone she touches. You should have researched her first husband before getting involved with this family. Harold Pemberton wrote that she erased his existence. Now you understand what that means. What do I do now? Amber asked, tears streaming down her face. Jessica felt no pity, only cold satisfaction. You survive. If you can, that's not my concern. She walked out, leaving Amber crying in the bathroom, and she felt nothing but the hollow completion of necessary destruction. Amber Whitley had been erased, reduced from confident mistress to broken woman working minimum wage, drinking away her regrets, living with the consequences of participating in someone else's cruelty. One weapon down. Now for the architect of it all. Jessica returned home to find Chris had been trying to reach her repeatedly. When she finally called him back, his voice was agitated and desperate. "Where have you been? I needed to talk to you." "Los Angeles," Jessica said calmly. "Handling personal matters." "What's wrong?" "Everything," Chris said. "The board is questioning every decision. Mother is pressuring me constantly. I feel like everyone's working against me." Jessica heard the paranoia in his voice, the isolation she'd been carefully engineering. "I'm home now. We can talk." When Chris came to her room that night, he looked exhausted and frightened. Jessica let him in but kept distance between them, watching him struggle to articulate his fears. "I don't know who to trust anymore," Chris admitted. "Everyone seems to have an agenda." "Maybe they do," Jessica said. "Or maybe you're finally seeing clearly what was always there." Chris looked at her with something like desperation. "You don't lie to me. You don't pretend to support me while undermining me. You're just honest, cold sometimes, but honest." Jessica almost laughed at the irony. Chris had no idea she'd been systematically dismantling his life for months. But she kept her face sympathetic. "You're going through a difficult time. The Trevor situation, the board pressure, it's affecting your perception." "Maybe you're right," Chris said, wanting to believe her. "Maybe I'm just paranoid." Jessica said nothing, letting him convince himself of his own instability. Dr. Cross had taught her well, make them question their own reality until they couldn't trust themselves. After Chris left, Jessica updated her journal with notes about Amber's complete destruction and Chris's increasing dependence on her validation. Everything was aligned for the next phase, the one that would annihilate Catherine and leave Chris with nothing but the smoking ruins of the empire his mother had corrupted. Tomorrow, the confrontation would happen. Bernard Mitchell would arrive with righteous fury. Gerald would present the evidence. Devon would witness his mother's betrayal, and Chris would watch his entire world collapse. Jessica stood at her window, looking out at the city, thinking about the girl who had walked down the aisle in white, believing in possibilities. That girl had been murdered on her wedding night. In her place was something that didn't flinch from necessary destruction, something that understood cruelty had to be answered with precision rather than emotion. Amber was gone. Catherine would fall tomorrow. Chris was unraveling, and Jessica felt nothing but the cold certainty that this was justice, not revenge. They had tried to erase her. She was simply erasing them back, more completely than they'd ever imagined possible. The mechanisms she'd set in motion were all clicking toward detonation. And tomorrow, the first major explosion would tear through the Mitchell family, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. Jessica had learned from Catherine, surpassed her, and now would demonstrate that the student had become something far more dangerous than the teacher. Not because she enjoyed destruction, but because she understood it was the only language these people spoke, and she was fluent. Chapter 6. The Mother Falls. Bernard Mitchell arrived at the mansion looking like vengeance itself. Decades of suppressed rage finally given righteous purpose. Jessica met him at the door with Uncle Gerald, and together they prepared for the confrontation that would destroy Catherine utterly. "Where do you want to do this?" Bernard asked, his hands gripping the folder of evidence so tightly his knuckles were white. "Chris's study," Jessica said. "With Devon present, Catherine needs to face all three of you simultaneously." She had arranged the meeting under the pretext of discussing board concerns, ensuring Chris and Devon would be there without alerting Catherine to the ambush. When everyone assembled, Catherine walked in, expecting to dominate whatever discussion was happening, seeing Bernard and freezing mid-step. "What is he doing here?" Catherine demanded, her voice sharp with alarm. "He's Theodore's brother," Jessica said calmly, closing the door behind Catherine. "He has every right to be here for this discussion about family finances." Catherine's eyes darted between the assembled people. Seeing Jessica's calculated calm, Gerald's satisfied smile, Bernard's barely controlled rage, and her son's confused faces. "What is this?" Jessica nodded to Gerald, who began laying documents on Chris's desk with methodical precision. "Your mother has been stealing from the family trust fund for years. Nearly $15 million has been siphoned into offshore accounts. Money that should have been your inheritance and Devon's." The room went silent except for the sound of papers being spread across polished wood. Devon stared at the documents in shock. Chris picked up pages with shaking hands, reading evidence of systematic theft and betrayal. "This is fabricated," Catherine said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Someone has manufactured evidence to attack me." "The documents are real," Gerald said calmly. "Bank records, transfer receipts, shell company registrations in your name. We have everything, Catherine. Years of theft documented in excruciating detail." Chris was reading through the evidence, his face going from confused to horrified to devastated. "Mother, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't steal from us." Catherine drew herself up, trying to reclaim her authority. "I managed the family money. Theodore left me in charge, and I made decisions that grew the estate. Sometimes that requires complex structures that funnel millions into your personal accounts," Bernard said, his voice hard with decades of suppressed fury. "Theodore left that trust for his sons. You've been robbing them since they were children, and I've been watching helplessly for years, unable to prove it." Devon was pale and silent, looking at his mother like she was a stranger. Chris kept reading through the documents, seeing the years of theft, the careful deception, the absolute betrayal of everything his father had intended. "There's more," Jessica said quietly. She nodded to Gerald, who produced another set of documents. "Catherine has been having an affair with Judge Philip Thornwood for years. That relationship has resulted in favorable rulings for Mitchell Hotels in several legal disputes. Corruption on top of theft." Catherine turned on Jessica with pure hatred. "You did this? You orchestrated all of this? You ungrateful little—" "Careful," Jessica interrupted, her voice soft but cutting. "You're already in enough trouble. Don't make it worse by saying something you'll regret." Chris was looking at the judge's rulings now, seeing the pattern of favoritism, understanding how his mother had been compromising Mitchell Hotel's integrity for her own benefit. His hands were shaking as he set down the papers. "The judge's wife has cancer," Jessica continued. "She's been undergoing chemotherapy while her husband betrays her with your mother. When she found out, she filed for divorce, and the affair became public. Catherine has been labeled a homewrecker in every society column." Catherine's face was losing color, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of total exposure. Chris looked at his mother, and his voice came out hollow and broken. "Did you ever care about us at all? Or were we just assets to manage?" Catherine's mask shattered completely. "Caring is weakness. Theodore cared, and where did it get him? Dead at 48 from a heart attack because he couldn't handle the stress of actually building something significant. I made this family powerful. I made you into someone who matters, Chris. Everything you have is because I was strong enough to do what Theodore couldn't." "You stole from your own children," Bernard said, standing up. "You corrupted Theodore's vision, pushed me out when I tried to stop you, and turned this family into exactly what he never wanted it to be." Devon spoke for the first time. his voice shaking. "Do it, Chris. Cut her off. I don't want her in my life anymore." Chris looked at his younger brother, seeing agreement in Devon's eyes, then turned back to their mother. Jessica watched him struggle, saw the lifetime of conditioning warring with the evidence in front of him. "You need to make a choice," Jessica said to Chris, her voice cutting through his paralysis. "The board already knows about the theft investigation. If you don't act decisively now, they'll question your judgment and your ability to lead. Your mother's crimes will destroy you too, unless you separate yourself from her completely." Chris stared at Jessica, understanding for the first time that she had orchestrated this entire confrontation, that she had been working toward this moment for months. "You planned this. All of it." "Your mother tried to break me on our wedding night," Jessica said, her voice steady and cold. "She orchestrated your infidelity as a test, wanted me to know my place. Instead, she gave me a reason to destroy her. This is what happens when you try to erase someone who refuses to disappear." Catherine was staring at Jessica with horror and grudging respect. "You've been planning this since your wedding night? Studying us, gathering weapons, waiting for the perfect moment?" "Yes," Jessica said simply. The word hung in the air. Confirmation that everything had been calculated, that Jessica had spent months becoming exactly what she needed to be to annihilate Catherine completely. Chris made his decision. His voice was hollow but firm. "Mother, you're removed from all company positions effective immediately. Your access to family accounts is revoked. You'll receive a basic allowance, nothing more. And you need to leave this house. You're no longer welcome here." Catherine looked at her son, perhaps for the first time, seeing him as someone capable of opposing her. "You're choosing her over me? Some girl from a bankrupt family over your own mother." "I'm choosing integrity over corruption," Chris said, though his voice broke. "Dad would be ashamed of what you've done. Get out, Mother, before I call the authorities about the theft." Catherine looked around the room, seeing no ally, no escape, no way to manipulate herself out of this corner. Her empire of influence was collapsing in real time, all her careful construction demolished in a single afternoon. She turned to Jessica one final time. "You've destroyed a family, made yourself into exactly what you claim to hate. I hope you can live with that." "You created me," Jessica said. "Every lesson I learned from watching you. The difference is I know when to stop. You never did." Catherine left the mansion that afternoon, taking only what she could carry, exiled from the world she'd dominated for decades. Jessica watched from the window as Catherine's car pulled away, feeling no triumph, just cold completion of necessary destruction. Behind her, Chris was sitting in his chair with his head in his hands. Devon was staring at nothing, and Bernard was crying quietly for his brother, who had died never knowing his wife was destroying everything he built. Jessica had annihilated Catherine Mitchell completely, stripped her of power, position, money, influence, and respect. The woman who had tried to erase her on her wedding night was now erased herself, relegated to a small apartment in Florida, abandoned by everyone she'd manipulated and controlled. Within days, the society columns were vicious. Catherine's friends abandoned her instantly. Her charity boards asked for her resignation. Her private clubs revoked her memberships. She became a pariah, shunned and forgotten by the world she'd once ruled. Jessica received reports about Catherine's deterioration from Gerald's contacts. The older woman was aging rapidly, her carefully maintained beauty crumbling under stress and isolation, her power completely evaporated. It was everything Jessica had wanted. Complete victory, total erasure, Catherine Mitchell reduced to nothing, just as she had tried to reduce Jessica to nothing. But standing in her room at the mansion that night, looking out at the gardens Catherine had designed, Jessica felt hollow rather than triumphant. She had destroyed the architect of her humiliation, but the victory tasted like ash. Natalie called that evening, her voice heavy with concern. "I heard about Catherine." "Jess, what did you do?" "What I had to do," Jessica said. You've become exactly like her, Natalie said. Can't you see that? You're destroying people, erasing them, becoming the monster you were fighting. Jessica thought about that for a long time after hanging up. Had she become Catherine? Or was she just someone who had learned to fight back in the only language her enemies understood? She didn't know the answer. But Catherine was gone, Chris was breaking, and there was still more destruction to come before Jessica would be finished. The war wasn't over yet. It was just entering its final, most devastating phase, and Jessica had one more enemy to destroy before her revenge would be complete. Chapter 7. The Husband Breaks. Chris sat in Dr. Marcus Reeves's office, his third therapy session this week, and felt his entire sense of self crumbling like sand. Catherine was gone, Trevor was in prison, the board questioned his every decision, and his wife had just revealed herself as the architect of his destruction. He didn't know who he was anymore. "Tell me about your earliest memories of your mother," Dr. Reeves said, his voice gentle but firm. Chris thought back, trying to find moments of maternal warmth, coming up empty. She was always testing me, praising me one day, criticizing me the next. I never knew which version I'd get. I spent my whole childhood trying to figure out what she wanted from me. That's called intermittent reinforcement, Dr. Reeves explained. It's one of the most powerful psychological conditioning techniques. It creates intense dependency because the subject never knows when approval will come, so they keep seeking it constantly. Chris felt something cold slide through him. She was conditioning me? Like training an animal? Dudu, she was shaping you into what she wanted you to be, Dr. Reeves said carefully, making you dependent on her approval while believing you were making your own choices. It's a form of psychological abuse, Chris, and it started when you were a child, before you had any defenses against it. Chris thought about every decision he'd ever made, wondering how many were genuinely his and how many were Catherine's programming. The marriage to Jessica. Mother pushed for that match, said it was good strategy, that Jessica's family needed us and we needed their manufacturing capabilities. I thought it was my decision, but Catherine presented the options in a way that made her preference seem like your own conclusion, Dr. Reeves finished. That's how she operated. Did you want to marry Jessica? Chris thought about his wedding day, trying to remember his own feelings rather than Catherine's expectations. I didn't know her. She was just there, someone Mother approved of. I went along with it because it seemed like what I was supposed to do. And on your wedding night, Chris's face flushed with shame. I went to Amber, my mother's protégé. I didn't even question it at the time. It seemed normal, like what was expected. Mother had told me marriages were business arrangements, that real connection happened elsewhere. I believed her. But Jessica saw you, Dr. Reeves said. She saw you with Amber that night. Chris nodded, feeling sick. She opened the door. She watched us, and the next morning she acted like nothing happened. I thought she was just accepting reality, that she understood how things worked. Now I understand she was watching me, learning, planning my destruction from day one. How does that make you feel? Chris laughed bitterly. Terrified, impressed, horrified at what I did to her. She didn't deserve that. She was innocent, brought into this family against her will to save her own family, and I destroyed any possibility of trust or respect on the first night. What kind of person does that? A person who was taught that other people are objects to be used, Dr. Reeves said gently. Your mother raised you to see relationships as transactions, intimacy as weakness. You were following her programming. That doesn't excuse what I did, Chris said, his voice breaking. Jessica didn't program me to be cruel. I chose that. I walked out of our bedroom and into Amber's bed, and I knew on some level it was wrong. I just didn't care because I'd been taught not to care. Dr. Reeves let Chris sit with that realization for a long moment. This is the hardest part of therapy, Chris, recognizing that you were shaped by abuse while also taking responsibility for your own choices. Both things can be true simultaneously. Chris spent the rest of the session unpacking his childhood, seeing patterns he'd never recognized before. How Catherine would praise him when he was ruthless, criticize him when he showed empathy. How she rewarded him for prioritizing business over relationships, punished him for caring about employees as people. How she systematically trained him to be a weapon that would extend her control. She made me into her, Chris realized. She created a copy of herself. Yes, Dr. Reeves agreed. And now you have to decide if that's who you want to continue being. After the session, Chris drove aimlessly through the city, thinking about Jessica. She had been in his house for over a year, playing the perfect wife while systematically destroying everyone who had hurt her. She had studied him, learned from Dr. Cross about his conditioning, used his vulnerabilities against him with the same precision Catherine had used to create those vulnerabilities in the first place. He should hate her. She had taken his empire, destroyed his mother, isolated him from everyone he trusted. But instead he felt something closer to awe. Jessica had survived what would have broken most people, had taught herself to fight back in the only language his family understood, and had won so completely that he was left with nothing but ruins. Chris found himself at his father's grave, a place he rarely visited. He knelt in front of the headstone with Theodore Mitchell's name and dates, and for the first time in his adult life he cried. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "Mother destroyed everything you built, and I helped her do it. I became exactly what you would have hated, and I hurt someone innocent because I'd been taught that was acceptable." He stayed there until dark, mourning the father he barely remembered, mourning the person he could have been if Catherine hadn't shaped him into a weapon, mourning the trust he'd destroyed with Jessica on their wedding night. When he finally left the cemetery, Chris made a decision. He couldn't fix what he'd broken with Jessica. That damage was permanent, but he could stop being the person Catherine had made him. He could become someone his father would have been proud of, even if it was too late for anyone to witness the transformation. Meanwhile, Jessica was executing the final phase of her plan. She met with the major investors, presenting a proposal for restructuring Mitchell Hotel's leadership. She positioned herself as interim CEO while Chris took medical leave to address his health issues. Her business plan was comprehensive: stabilize the properties, focus on sustainable growth, integrate Bruce manufacturing for cost reduction, establish Devon's boutique model as a premium subsidiary. The investors studied her proposal carefully, watching as Chris made another poor decision during a board meeting, and they saw the contrast between Jessica's steady competence and Chris's increasing instability. "The board needs to vote on this," Richard Langford said. "But I think you have the support, Jessica. Chris clearly needs time away from leadership stress." Jessica also arranged one final psychological blow. She planted evidence suggesting she was having an affair with Devon, carefully doctored text messages and fabricated meeting records, and left them where Chris's paranoia would find them. The explosion was spectacular. Chris confronted Devon at a family gathering, wild-eyed and enraged, accusing him of betrayal. Devon was shocked and confused, defending Jessica and revealing that she had been his financial backer all along. "She saved me when you and Mother were trying to destroy me," Devon shouted at his brother. "She's been more family to me than either of you ever were. And for your information, we're business partners, nothing more. But you're so paranoid now, you see betrayal everywhere." Chris realized his wife had elevated his younger brother above him, had created an ally right under his nose, had built Devon's success while engineering Chris's failure. The betrayal he felt was consuming, and he went directly to Vanessa Klein, seeking comfort. He crossed lines that night, seeking solace in the arms of someone who wasn't his wife. And Jessica's investigators documented everything. The next morning, Chris woke up next to Vanessa feeling disgusted with himself, understanding he'd just given Jessica more ammunition if she wanted to use it. At the board meeting, Jessica presented her restructuring proposal with clinical precision. Uncle Bernard spoke in support, describing Chris's mismanagement. Devon spoke about the need for ethical leadership. The investors expressed their confidence in Jessica's vision. The vote was called. Jessica became CEO. Chris was placed on mandatory medical leave. His empire, built on his father's legacy and maintained through Catherine's ruthless tactics, had been taken from him by the woman he'd betrayed on their wedding night. Chris sat in stunned silence as the board members filed out. Jessica was the last to leave, and she paused at the door. "You should have seen me as a person," Jessica said quietly, "not property to be used. That was your mistake." She closed the door behind her, and Chris sat alone in the boardroom where his father had once led with integrity, understanding finally that he had destroyed himself. Jessica had just been the catalyst, forcing him to face consequences he'd spent his whole life avoiding. That night, Chris sat in his apartment staring at nothing, and his phone rang. Dr. Reeves, checking in after hearing about the board meeting through professional networks. "How are you feeling?" the therapist asked. "Like I deserve this," Chris said. "Like every bit of this is exactly what I earned." "That's progress," Dr. Reeves said. "Accepting responsibility instead of blaming others. Now comes the harder part. Deciding who you want to be going forward." Chris thought about his father, about the man Theodore had been before Catherine corrupted everything, about the possibility of becoming someone worthwhile, even though it was far too late for redemption. "I want to be better," Chris said. "Not to win Jessica back or reclaim my position, just to be better, for myself, to prove I can be more than what my mother made me." "Then we'll work on that," Dr. Reeves said. "Starting tomorrow." "Same time." After hanging up, Chris began writing letters to Jessica, long confessional letters detailing his understanding of what he'd done, his acknowledgement of her pain, his recognition that she had every right to destroy him. He wrote about his therapy insights, about Catherine's conditioning, about seeing Jessica as a person for the first time. He never sent the letters. They were for him, part of his process of becoming someone different. Someone who took responsibility, someone who understood that actions had consequences and cruelty deserved punishment. Jessica, meanwhile, moved into Chris's former office and began transforming Mitchell Hotels into something that would have made Theodore proud. She promoted overlooked talent, implemented ethical practices, built something better than what Chris had inherited. She had won everything. The company, the empire, the complete destruction of everyone who'd tried to destroy her. She should feel triumphant. Instead, she felt hollow, as if winning had carved out essential parts of her, leaving nothing but the cold machinery of revenge where a person used to be. But the war wasn't over yet. One final chapter remained before Jessica could decide who she wanted to become after survival. Chapter 8. The Empire Claimed. Jessica stood in what had been Chris's office, now stripped of his presence and redesigned with clean lines and natural light. A photograph of her father Raymond sat on the desk, a reminder of why she'd done all this. He had died weeks ago, his final months made comfortable by the security Jessica provided, and she kept his picture there as both memorial and motivation. The company responded to her leadership like a drowning person finally getting air. Jessica was demanding but fair, strategic but ethical. She promoted talented people who had been systematically overlooked. A brilliant woman who'd been stuck in middle management for years because she didn't play political games. A creative man who'd been dismissed because he prioritized quality over profit margins. A whole cadre of capable people who had been waiting for someone to recognize their worth. Within 3 months, stock prices recovered. Within 6 months, Mitchell Hotels was thriving beyond previous benchmarks. The staff worked harder not from fear, but from genuine engagement, feeling valued for the first time in years. Devon's Boutique Properties became a premium subsidiary brand under Jessica's strategic vision, offering unique luxury experiences that attracted new markets. Bruce Manufacturing integrated seamlessly, reducing costs while improving quality. Everything Jessica touched seemed to turn to gold, and the contrast to Chris's volatile leadership was stark and obvious. The business press called her a visionary. Magazines wanted her story for inspirational features about women overcoming adversity. Book deals and speaking engagements piled up in her inbox. Jessica declined them all, preferring to work rather than perform, to build rather than boast. But she made sure Chris saw every article, every glowing review of her leadership, every comparison that painted him as the troubled heir and her as the savior. She wanted him to understand completely what he'd lost when he walked out of their bedroom on their wedding night. Chris had collapsed entirely. He lived alone in the downtown apartment, attending therapy 5 times a week now, working through decades of Catherine's psychological abuse and his own learned cruelty. Dr. Reeves was helping him confront truths he'd spent his life avoiding, and the process was excruciating. One session particularly devastated him. Dr. Reeves asked Chris to list everyone he'd hurt, to really think about the damage he'd caused throughout his life. Chris spent an hour naming people, employees he'd fired cruelly, business partners he'd betrayed, the brother he'd dismissed and belittled, the father whose legacy he'd corrupted, and Jessica, who topped the list with her wedding night humiliation. "I destroyed her trust before she even knew me," Chris said, his voice breaking. "She was innocent, brought into this family against her will, and I made sure she knew she was nothing but property on the very first night." "What kind of person does that to someone?" "A person who was taught that was acceptable behavior," Dr. Reeves said. "But you're not that person anymore. You're someone who recognizes the harm and wants to be different. That's significant growth, Chris." But Chris couldn't forgive himself. He knew that growth didn't undo damage, that understanding his conditioning didn't erase the pain he'd caused, that becoming better now didn't make the past acceptable. He started writing to Jessica regularly, letters he never sent, filling journals with confessional pages about his therapy insights and his understanding of what he'd done. The letters helped him process, even though Jessica would never read them. Meanwhile, Jessica discovered something that complicated her feelings. Uncle Gerald brought her news that Chris had quietly established a foundation in Theodore's name, funded by selling all his personal assets. The foundation helped young entrepreneurs build ethical businesses, specifically targeting people from difficult backgrounds who needed support and guidance. "He's given away everything," Gerald said, showing Jessica the documentation. "The cars, the art collection, the investment properties, all of it liquidated to fund this foundation. He's living on basically nothing, teaching at community college, trying to help people build what he destroyed in himself." Jessica looked at the foundation's mission statement, reading Chris's words about his father's vision and the importance of ethical leadership. And she felt something crack in her carefully constructed armor. Chris was genuinely changing, not to manipulate her or win her back, but because he finally understood the damage he'd caused and wanted to prevent others from becoming what he'd been. It was too late for redemption, obviously. Some betrayals left permanent scars, but the transformation was real, and Jessica hadn't expected that. She also received a letter from Chris through his attorney, not begging for forgiveness, but simply acknowledging responsibility without excuses or self-pity. The letter detailed his therapy work, his understanding of Catherine's conditioning, and his acceptance that Jessica had every right to destroy him. It ended, "I hope you find peace, Jessica, even though I took it from you first." Jessica read that letter 3 times, feeling her certainty about Chris being irredeemable start to waver. He was broken, yes, but the breaking had revealed something she never expected to find: genuine remorse and the capacity for actual change. The board wanted to make Jessica's CEO position permanent, with a contract that would establish her as one of the most powerful women in the hospitality industry. She should sign immediately, cementing her victory completely. Instead, Jessica found herself at her father's grave, telling him about everything she'd accomplished, everything she'd destroyed. waiting for the satisfaction that never came. "I won, Dad," she said to the marble headstone. "I destroyed everyone who tried to break me. But you always said power without purpose is just destruction. What's my purpose now that the revenge is complete?" She thought about her father saying when she was young that the strongest people build rather than just fight. She had spent over 2 years destroying. What would she build now? Jessica called an emergency board meeting. Standing before the same people who had removed Chris, she presented a new proposal. She would remain CEO for 18 more months to ensure stability and proper succession planning, then transition to chairman of the board while recommending Devon as her successor. "Devon represents ethical leadership and innovative thinking," Jessica explained. "He's proven his capabilities with his own properties, and he carries his father's values. He's the right person to lead Mitchell Hotels into its future." The board was surprised, but ultimately supportive. Richard Langford studied Jessica curiously. "You're voluntarily giving up operational power. That's unusual." "I'm choosing strategic oversight over daily management," Jessica replied, "and ensuring the company has leadership that will maintain its integrity long term. That matters more than personal power." After the meeting, Jessica made another decision that shocked everyone. She invited Chris to return to the company, not to leadership, but to a newly created position, Director of Cultural Legacy. He would teach new employees about Theodore Mitchell's vision, help rebuild the ethical foundation that Catherine had corrupted, and contribute positively without having power he could abuse. She met with Chris to explain the offer, their first face-to-face conversation in 8 months. He looked different, thinner but healthier, his eyes clear instead of wild with stress. He listened without interruption as Jessica outlined the position. "Why?" he asked when she finished. Jessica had prepared for this question, but now, sitting across from this man who had destroyed her on their wedding night, but who had genuinely transformed in his breaking, she found the answer more complicated than she expected. "Because complete destruction serves no purpose except feeding darkness," she said finally. "Catherine made you into a weapon and pointed you at me. You hurt me with it. But staying consumed by that hatred means she still wins by making us both into versions of her. This isn't forgiveness, Chris. It's me refusing to let revenge define me forever." Chris nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. "I don't deserve this." "No," Jessica agreed. "You don't. But maybe you can earn it by actually helping people instead of hurting them. And if you ever use this opportunity to harm anyone the way you harmed me, I will destroy you again. And this time, there will be nothing left." "I understand," Chris said quietly. "Thank you, Jessica, for this. For showing me what I was. For being stronger than everyone who tried to break you." They established clear boundaries. Professional relationship only. No personal connection. No expectation of reconciliation. The marriage existed on paper only, and neither bothered to dissolve it because it no longer mattered. Jessica began slowly reconnecting with parts of herself she'd frozen during her revenge campaign. She spent time with Natalie's daughter, discovering joy in the child's uncomplicated laughter. She took painting classes, finding an outlet for emotions she'd suppressed for years. She volunteered at a women's shelter, helping others escape situations where they felt powerless. And slowly, incrementally, Jessica began to thaw. The armor remained as scar tissue, permanent reminder of what she'd survived, but it wasn't her entire identity anymore. She could be both the woman who had destroyed her enemies and the woman who was learning to build something new from the ruins. Uncle Gerald visited one final time before retiring completely. He looked at his niece and shook his head with something like sadness. "You were the best student I ever had. You could have ruled empires, destroyed anyone who crossed you. Instead, you're teaching people and painting pictures. It's disappointing. It's called knowing when to stop," Jessica said. "You should try it." Gerald left, and Jessica never saw him again. She had learned everything he could teach, then surpassed him by understanding what he never would. Revenge was just survival, not victory. Real victory was learning to live afterward. As the transition date approached, Jessica felt strangely nervous. She had defined herself by revenge for so long that stepping back from daily control felt like losing identity. Who was she when she wasn't destroying enemies or proving herself? She didn't know yet. But maybe that uncertainty was okay. Maybe becoming someone new meant not knowing exactly who that person would be, staying open to possibilities instead of demanding certainty. The girl who walked down the aisle in white was dead and buried. The cold destroyer who replaced her was evolving into something more complex. Someone who had survived the fire, learned to wield it, and then learned when to let it die down to manageable heat instead of all-consuming flames. Jessica stood at her office window, watching the sunset paint the city gold, thinking about everything she'd accomplished and everything she'd lost in the process. She had won every battle she fought. But Natalie's question haunted her. What was the point of surviving if you couldn't actually live afterward? Tomorrow, she would continue building instead of destroying. She would teach rather than terrorize. She would create opportunities rather than eliminate obstacles. It wouldn't undo the damage she'd done or the person she'd become in pursuit of revenge. But maybe slowly she could become someone who carried both versions inside her without being defined by either. Someone who had walked through fire and emerged not as ash, but as something forged and unbreakable. Strong enough to destroy when necessary. Wise enough to stop when destruction served no purpose. Brave enough to learn how to live after survival. And that, maybe, was the truest victory of all. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Devon's first board meeting as CEO designate was remarkable for its lack of drama. He presented his vision for Mitchell Hotels with confidence and creativity, and the board members responded enthusiastically. Jessica watched from her chairman position, feeling something almost like pride as Devon proved he was ready for leadership. After the meeting, Devon found her in her office. "I couldn't have done this without you. You gave me resources and confidence when everyone else was trying to keep me small." "You did the work," Jessica said. "I just gave you a platform. What you built on it was all yours." "When this all started, when you first helped me, was it strategy or genuine?" Devon asked. Jessica considered lying, then chose honesty. "Strategy. I needed allies, and you were positioned perfectly. But watching you grow, seeing what you could become when you weren't being crushed by Catherine and Chris, that became genuine. You deserved better than what this family gave you." Devon nodded, accepting the truth without resentment. "I'll try to honor that trust and Dad's legacy. He would have liked what we've built here." Chris's cultural legacy program was surprisingly successful. He taught new employees about ethical leadership with a raw honesty that resonated because he didn't hide his own failures. He spoke openly about his mother's corruption and his own cruelty, using himself as a cautionary tale about what happened when people prioritized power over integrity. Jessica attended one of his training sessions anonymously, sitting in the back of the room, while Chris talked to a group of young professionals about the importance of seeing employees as people rather than assets. "I was taught that caring was weakness," Chris said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I learned to see relationships as transactions, people as tools to be used. And I destroyed every meaningful connection I could have had because I believed that made me strong. The truth is, it just made me empty." One young woman raised her hand. "How did you realize you were wrong?" Chris paused, his eyes finding Jessica in the back row. She didn't react, just sat there watching him, and he looked away before answering. "Someone I hurt refused to stay hurt. She fought back, destroyed everything I thought made me powerful, and forced me to see what I'd become. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you the truth about yourself, even when that truth is devastating." After the session, Chris approached Jessica in the hallway. "You came to watch." I wanted to see if this was genuine or just another performance, Jessica said. And? What's the verdict? Jessica studied his face, looking for manipulation or hidden angles, finding only exhaustion and genuine remorse. It's genuine. You've changed. Not enough to undo what you did, but enough to be different going forward. That's all I can hope for, Chris said quietly. I can't fix what I broke. I can only try to help others avoid becoming what I was. They stood in the hallway of Mitchell Hotel's headquarters, two people who had destroyed each other in different ways, learning to exist in the same space without causing more damage. Catherine made one final attempt to hurt Jessica. She vandalized Raymond's grave, smashing the headstone and spray-painting vicious words across everything. When Jessica arrived at the cemetery and saw the destruction, she felt rage surge through her, hot and consuming. But then she looked at the broken marble and realized something important. Catherine had no power anymore. This was a pathetic lashing out from someone who had been completely defeated. The vandalism couldn't touch Raymond's actual legacy or Jessica's love for him. Jessica had the grave restored beautifully, upgraded to stunning marble with an inscription about Raymond's integrity and kindness. She refused to let Catherine's final poison contaminate her father's memory. When she ran into Catherine weeks later at a public event, the older woman looked diminished and desperate, trying to maintain appearances while everyone avoided her. Catherine approached Jessica in a restroom, and for the first time since her exile, they were alone together. You won, Catherine said, her voice bitter. You took everything. Are you satisfied now? Jessica washed her hands calmly. You tried to erase me. I erased you back. That's not satisfaction. That's just consequences. I made you into this, Catherine insisted. You became exactly like me to beat me. We're the same. Jessica turned to face her fully. No, we're not. I destroyed people who tried to destroy me first. You destroyed people because it made you feel powerful. I learned when to stop. You never did. That's the difference between survival and sadism. She walked out, leaving Catherine standing there alone, and Jessica felt no triumph, just the quiet relief of knowing this particular enemy no longer had any power to hurt her. Jessica began therapy herself, not with one of Gerald's associates, but with a genuine professional who could help her process trauma and grief. Dr. Emma Simmons didn't judge Jessica's revenge, but helped her understand its cost and how to move beyond it. You did what you needed to do to survive, Dr. Simmons said during one session. But survival and healing are different things. You survived by becoming strategic and ruthless. Now you need to heal by becoming human again. What if I can't? Jessica asked. What if this is all that's left? You're here in therapy asking that question, Dr. Simmons pointed out. That tells me there's more left than you think. The coldness was armor. You can choose to take off armor when the battle is over. Is the battle over? Jessica wondered aloud. That's for you to decide, Dr. Simmons said. But consider this. You've destroyed everyone who hurt you. You've built something better than what they corrupted. You're helping others now instead of just defending yourself. Maybe the battle ended, and you're still fighting because you don't know how to stop. Jessica thought about that for days. Was she still in battle mode when the war was actually over? Was she keeping her armor on out of habit rather than necessity? She started doing small things to reconnect with herself beyond the destroyer she'd become. She took painting classes and discovered a love for abstract art that let her express emotions without words. She volunteered at a women's shelter, helping women escape dangerous situations, using her resources to give them fresh starts. She let Natalie's daughter teach her how to play and laugh, rediscovering joy she thought she'd lost forever. Slowly, incrementally, Jessica began to thaw. The armor remained as scar tissue, permanent reminder of what she'd survived. But it wasn't her entire identity anymore. Chris wrote to her occasionally, letters about his therapy progress, his work with the cultural program, his attempts to become someone Theodore would have been proud of. Jessica read the letters but rarely responded. maintaining distance because some wounds were too deep to bridge completely. But she didn't hate him anymore. She just felt indifferent, which was its own kind of freedom. He had hurt her. She had destroyed him for it, and now they were both trying to become something better than what that conflict had made them. One evening, Natalie invited Jessica to dinner at her house. Jessica arrived to find a warm, chaotic family scene. Natalie cooking with her husband helping, their daughter playing on the floor. Laughter and love filling every corner. "This could have been you," Natalie said gently, pouring wine. "If Chris had been different, if Catherine hadn't been cruel, you could have had this kind of life." Jessica thought about walking down the aisle in white, still believing in possibilities, before that door opened at 2 a.m. and shattered everything. No, this was never going to be my life. The Mitchells destroyed that possibility on my wedding night. But maybe I can build something different now. Like what? Natalie asked. "I don't know yet," Jessica admitted. "But something that's mine, not defined by what they tried to take from me or what I took back from them. Something new." As the transition date approached, Jessica felt ready to step back from daily control. She had built something sustainable, had positioned Devon to succeed, had created foundations that would outlast any individual leader. Mitchell Hotels honored Theodore's vision again, and that was enough. On her last day as CEO, Jessica stood in the office she'd claimed from Chris, looking at her father's photograph on the desk. "I did it, Dad. I survived them. I built something better than what they had. Now I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not fighting." She left the office, left the daily operations, and stepped into her chairman role with relief rather than regret. She had won every battle she'd fought. Now it was time to figure out what came after victory. The girl who walked down the aisle in white was dead and buried. The cold destroyer who replaced her was evolving into something more complex and human. Someone who had survived the fire and was learning to build rather than just burn. And that evolution, painful and uncertain as it was, felt like the truest victory of all. Not destroying enemies, not claiming power, just learning to live as a complete human being again, carrying both strength and softness, both strategic brilliance and genuine compassion. Jessica didn't know exactly who she was becoming, but for the first time since her wedding night, she felt curious about possibilities rather than just focused on destruction. And maybe that curiosity, that openness to becoming rather than just surviving, was what healing actually looked like. Chapter 10. The Woman Who Survived. The transition ceremony was held on a clear morning at Mitchell Hotel's flagship property, and Jessica felt lighter than she had in years. She handed CEO responsibilities to Devon officially, watching him accept the role with grace and confidence, and she stepped into her chairman position, feeling not loss but relief. "You're really doing this," Devon said afterward, holding the symbolic keys to his new office. "Giving up daily control." "I'm keeping strategic oversight," Jessica corrected. "But yes, you're ready, and I'm ready to step back. There's more to life than running companies." That evening, Jessica stood on her apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the city gold. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chris, something he did occasionally now, maintaining their professional relationship. "First board meeting next Tuesday. Agenda attached. Thank you for everything, Jessica. Dad would have loved what you've built." Jessica read the message and felt warmth instead of cold satisfaction. She had spent so long focused on destruction that learning to feel genuine positive emotions again was strange and uncomfortable, but somehow right. Natalie visited with her daughter, and Jessica spent the afternoon playing with the little girl, letting her paint her nails and tell elaborate stories about imaginary friends. Watching Natalie's easy maternal affection, Jessica felt no envy. Just quiet appreciation that her sister had the life she deserved. "You seem different," Natalie observed after putting her daughter down for a nap. "Lighter somehow. Less like you're carrying the weight of planning someone's destruction." "I'm not planning anything anymore," Jessica admitted. "I won everything I set out to win. Now I'm trying to figure out what comes next. What do you want? Natalie asked. Jessica thought about that question seriously. I want to help people who are in positions I was in. Women forced into impossible situations, people being used as pawns in family power games. I want to build something that prevents what happened to me from happening to others. That's beautiful, Natalie said, squeezing her hand. Dad would be proud. Jessica established a foundation in Raymond's name, funded by her wealth from Mitchell Hotels, dedicated to helping people escape toxic family situations and build independent lives. She poured energy into it, using her strategic skills for creation rather than destruction, and found satisfaction she'd never experienced during her revenge campaign. Chris's cultural legacy program continued thriving, and he occasionally consulted with Jessica about expansion possibilities. Their interactions remained professional and bounded, but the hostility had faded into something more like mutual respect between former enemies who had both transformed. One afternoon, Jessica received a letter from Chris that was different from his usual updates. This one was personal, handwritten, vulnerable. I know you'll never forgive me, and I'm not asking you to, but I wanted you to know that you saved my life by destroying it. Catherine had made me into something monstrous, and I would have stayed that way if you hadn't forced me to see what I'd become. You could have just ruined me and walked away. Instead, you gave me a chance to become something better. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift by helping others avoid becoming what I was. Thank you, Jessica, for surviving me, for showing me what strength actually looks like. Jessica read the letter 3 times, feeling something crack in her carefully maintained emotional distance. Chris had genuinely changed, not to manipulate or win her back, but because being destroyed had somehow freed him from Catherine's conditioning. She didn't respond to the letter. Some things didn't need responses, but she filed it away, acknowledging that Chris's transformation was real and permanent. Months passed, and Jessica found rhythm in her new life. She chaired board meetings, providing strategic guidance without micromanaging daily operations. She worked on her foundation, helping women escape situations where they felt powerless. She painted abstract pieces that expressed emotions she couldn't articulate, filling her apartment with color and creativity. She traveled to New Zealand to open Mitchell Hotel's newest property, a stunning, sustainable resort that represented everything the company had become under her guidance. Standing on the balcony of the resort, watching mountains paint themselves gold in sunset light, Jessica felt genuine peace for the first time since her wedding night. Her phone buzzed. Chris, asking for approval on a new mentorship initiative. She provided concise feedback, their communication efficient and professional, carrying none of the history that bound them. Behind her in the suite, Natalie's daughter was playing, her innocent laughter filling the space. Jessica had invited them to the opening, wanting to share this moment with people who mattered rather than celebrating alone. "Aunt Jess, look at this shell I found," the little girl exclaimed, running to show her treasure. Jessica admired the shell with genuine interest, seeing the child's pure joy in simple discovery, remembering what it felt like to find wonder in the world before Catherine Mitchell tried to destroy that capacity. She hadn't forgiven Catherine or Chris. She never would. Some betrayals carved permanent grooves into your soul, but she had stopped letting that betrayal define her entire existence. The grooves remained as scars, proof she'd survived, but they weren't bleeding wounds anymore. That night, after Natalie put her daughter to bed, the sisters sat on the balcony, sharing wine and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Are you happy?" Natalie asked. Jessica thought about that question carefully. "I don't know if happy is the right word, but I'm not consumed by rage anymore. I'm not planning destruction. I'm building things, helping people, discovering interests beyond corporate warfare. If that's not happiness, it's at least peace. Dad would be proud of you," Natalie said. "Not for the revenge part, but for surviving it and becoming something more afterward." Jessica raised her glass to the mountains, to survival, and to whatever comes after. They drank together, and Jessica felt the weight of the past finally beginning to lift.